and a professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. He has an MA from the University of Edinburgh and is a doctor of philosophy from Oxford University. He has I could spend the whole time now telling you the number of books that he's written, been involved with, etc., but he obviously has a deep understanding and experience of working in the academic field. He's also been Director of European Studies for Florida International University from 2005 to 2008, co-director of the Miami European Union Center from 2005 to 2007, and has chaired the Department of Political Science for 6 years up to 2005. Before I hand you over to Dinkol, I just found that the work in progress he has on at the moment, his book is working on at the moment on manuscript, is Political Polarization in America. And maybe we ought to have you back and talk about that another time. Dinkol,
okay.
Welcome.
We'll see how this one goes. Thank you very much, Neil. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. When I was given the opportunity to talk about British politics, I grabbed it with both hands because it's not an opportunity that I get too frequently here in Miami, where I've lived for 22 years. Just for the sake of background, I was actually born and raised in northeast Scotland, in the Aberdeen area, and I sort of, by a series of happenstances, ended up in South Florida. My name is pronounced like a 5-cent coin, an old Scottish derivation of Nicholas. And, you know, there was an actor with my name, and a Walter Scott character with my name, and I think there was a politician called Nicholas Souter for a while, but I'm sorry if there one lady here who said she was expecting a young lady this morning and sell it to you, right? So yes, this was a very interesting election because I think it comes at the end of an era in British politics. When I was growing up in the UK, we were sort of very much in the idea of the swing of the pendulum. And government alternated at fairly short intervals between the two major parties, and the other parties didn't get much of a look at. You know, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, Harold Wilson again, and then Margaret Thatcher, a long era of conservative rule for almost 18 years, followed by 13 years of Labour Party rule. During that time, there was sort of an underlying trend for support for the two major parties, which used to add up to about 90% of the vote, the popular vote in British elections, to decline. To now, I think, about 70% or less. But the electoral system, plurality voting system, maintained much of their dominance in the House of Commons, and worked to the disadvantage of the Liberals, and then their successor party, the Liberal Democrats, and the nationalist parties, which were beginning to appear on the scene, always underrepresented in terms of seats compared to their vote. So we had the Thatcher era, the Blair era, which is something of a reaction to that, and the process during the last few elections of the Conservative Party somehow trying to claw its way back to competitiveness with Labour. And I guess finally in the last 3 years or so, that happened. The Conservatives, for the first time since '97, looked like a realistic alternative. And Gordon Brown, like John Major in 1992 and 1997, was an incumbent prime minister facing a likely defeat. And so, like Major in those years, he waited out the maximum length of the term. It's rather interesting, when Brown came in 2007, he had a honeymoon period. And he could have gone and called an election in the autumn of 2007, and he might have won it. But he didn't. He's not by instinct a gambler, and as a result, He got hit by waves of unpopularity, economic crisis, and the general feeling of exhaustion that comes with a government that's been in office for a long time. We saw it with the Conservatives at the tail end of the Thatcher Major era. We see it happening in the Brown administration at the tail end of the fourth term. Third term of Labour rule. So the election took place. Brown, in a sense, gave away his card of being able to call the election when he wanted, waited out the maximum time, waiting for something to turn up that might bail him out. The election took place with a looming economic crisis in terms of the UK budget deficit, with major public spending cuts in the offing, regardless of who got into number 10 Downing Street. As many of the commentators observed, this would have been a good election to lose in many ways. It's not going to be easy to govern the UK in the next few years. The Conservatives, to win the election, needed a record swing of votes and seats to win a majority, about 6.5%. They faced a steep mountain. They had 3 fairly serious defeats. Michael Howard made up some ground in 2005, but they were still at under 200 seats, needing 326 to get a majority going into this election. David Cameron had come in as a very dynamic, reforming, youthful Conservative leader, and undoubtedly rejuvenated the party to a great extent, and provided, I think, its most credible alternative to Labour rule in many years. But nevertheless, there are still doubts about him. His background, very establishment. Was David Cameron too posh to connect with voters in modern Britain? You know, we hadn't had an old Etonian prime minister, I think. You had to go back to Douglas Hume in the 1960s. Also, I think, doubts about Cameron and doubts about the Conservative economic response led to a drop in the Tory lead in the winter and spring of 2010. So that it looked like being, instead of a blowout for the Conservatives, a much more competitive election. And then the unknown factor, of course, was the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats had grown to getting regularly over 20% of the vote in UK elections. Of course, usually under 10% of the seats in the House of Commons because of the vagaries of the electoral system, but their vote is very important. For the Conservatives to win an outright majority, they not only had to take a lot of seats from Labour, which they looked like doing, but they had also to try to knock back the Liberal Democrats, who were their main competition in many parts of the country. We often tend to forget the UK election system, the UK party system these days varies from various regions of the UK. That'll come up in a map that I'll show in a minute. In many parts of the UK, it's a Tory-Liberal battle for most seats. In suburban areas, it tends to be more a Tory-Labour battle. In Scotland, it's like a Labour-Scottish nationalist-Liberal battle. The idea of a uniform swing in that situation becomes somehow less meaningful, and it put an extra little hurdle in the way of the Conservatives to getting a majority. They not only had to take seats from Labour, they also had to take them off the Liberal Democrats. Also, another factor is that the British boundary drawing system has quite a time lag in it, a time lag that works to the advantage of the Labour Party. They're working off boundaries from the 2001 census in the UK. And population movements tend to be from inner cities being Labour areas to suburbs being Conservative areas, but there tends to be an overrepresentation of inner city urban areas which are very solidly Labour. So there's an inherent Labour bias in the system for that reason, which put, again, an extra little hurdle in the way of the Conservatives in getting a majority. The biggest new feature in the actual campaign, of course, were the TV debates. This was something that we're very used to in American politics, and many West European democracies having TV debates, but in Britain, unprecedented. Brits are very used to the sort of back and forth in the House of Commons between the party leaders, but actually having them in a studio, going head to head in the TV debate format was something very new. Many Conservatives were very frustrated that David Cameron agreed to this. Their attitude being, you're ahead, why do this? You know, you're creating a situation where you could actually shoot yourself in the foot. Gordon Brown, you know, there was no loss for him in agreeing to TV debates. Labour needed something to turn up to try to save them in this election, and maybe the debates would provide that factor. And of course, for the Liberal Democrats, for their party leader to have equal billing and status with the leaders of the other parties in a TV studio was symbolically very significant. There's no doubt that the debates presidentialized the contest, and they definitely boosted the status of the Liberal Democratic leader Nick Clegg, especially the first debate. And although the Liberal Democratic surge after that debate didn't last, I think that the impact of the debate was still significant in denying the Conservatives an outright majority. It helped sustain the Liberal Democratic vote. It helped beat back much of the Conservative efforts to take seats from them, and have made the coalition government possible. Prime Minister Brown didn't have a happy campaign. He is not by nature someone whose personality is particularly suited to modern day politics. I think there was a little TV vignette that kind of captured that after the election when, in his farewell speech, Mrs. Brown brought his children out of number 10, and many people observed that's the first time that they'd actually seen them. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, maybe there's something noble in a sense in not wanting to expose your children to, you know, sort of television cameras and the press on a regular basis, but I think it says something about Brown's somewhat old-fashioned kind of approach, you know, that he didn't even want to showcase his family in the election campaign. And he, in a way, consistently defied options where he could have tried to, in a sense, humanize himself somewhat. It's rather unfair, but he did not have, I suppose, a demeanor for the television age by comparison with, say, Cameron or Clegg, and I think it showed during the campaign. And of course, the famous sort of gaffe into the microphone about the bigoted woman played into all Brown's problems. Although I don't think we can blame the Labour defeat on him. I think the party in itself was somewhat exhausted after 13 years. And in the final days, I think he you know, fought back quite effectively. And as is typical, I think, in the last lap of a British election, there tends to be some movement back towards the major parties, and the Liberal Party gets squeezed again by the wasted vote argument, so that their surge sort of stalled and then sort of rolled back somewhat in the final days of the election, as many people were thinking, well, goodness, how do I use my vote to stop Cameron, or how do I use my vote to get Brown out? And that tended to work against the Liberal Democrats. The result, which should also come up here, we can see in terms of the vote share, the Conservatives gained about 4% off 2005, perhaps not as much as they would have hoped. They were looking to get to about 40%, which is the level, they had levels in the sort of 43-44% range in the Thatcher era. So as you can see, while they came back in 2009, they're still well below the levels that they had then. Labour lost to everybody. They lost votes to the Tories, they lost votes to the Liberals, and they lost votes to the others. where the others were a significant factor. They're down 6.2. That is their worst showing in a while. I think Michael Foote in 1984 did worse. 1983 did worse than this, about 28%. But this was not a good showing by the Labour Party. And if you take away, you know, in a sense, they were bailed out by their continuing strength in Scotland, Wales, and the inner cities. If you were to take Scotland out of the equation, the result looks very poor indeed. But if you look at the seats, they held on to 258 seats, even with under 30% of the vote. So the electoral system's still helping the Labour Party. The Liberal Democrats went up a little in vote share, and they lost a few seats, all to the Conservatives. So the Conservatives were able to claw a few seats from the Liberal Democrats, but not as many as they might have liked. And overall, their support held, while not getting to the stratospheric levels that they'd hoped after the first debate, held up consistently at 23% and not that far behind the Labour Party. The swing was 5%, not enough to get a majority, and as you can see on the other side, they needed 326 to win, and they got to 306. 97 gains, which is a lot from Labour, but not quite enough to get there. Here we see the map, courtesy of Wikipedia. And the map sort of demonstrates the nature of this kind of different party systems in different regions of the UK. As you can see in Scotland, we have, out of about 59 seats, there's only one Conservative one on the Scottish borders there. Very solid block of Labour seats in Western Scotland and Glasgow. And then much of rural and suburban Scotland is a battle between the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats. Totally different to the English picture. Scotland has kind of a four-party system, which is skewed by the electoral system towards Labour. Totally different pattern to the English result. Labour didn't lose, there was a very small swing against them in Scotland. They basically held their support. The other Scottish parties didn't gain. You know, we can interpret this numerous ways. In Scotland, there's still kind of associate the Conservatives with Englishness, with Thatcherism. Was there also residual Scottish support for the local boy Gordon Brown? You see in the west of England, the southwest England, it's mainly a battle between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And you can see in the urban areas, which are sort of blown up in insets, you have inner city cores, which still tend to be fairly solidly Labour, and conservative belts of suburbs around them with some Liberal Democrats as well. Oh, no, I don't want you to see that. I don't want to do PowerPoint, so let's just close it up. There we go.
Can I ask a quick question? We don't have the benefit of the color code, so there was a white spot right in the middle of that map, which is sort of odd.
Let's cancel it, Christine. Let's go back to the map. Can we keep it there?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, the white spot is the speaker. He's actually a conservative, but he's theoretically non-partisan and usually unopposed. And the black spot is a district that I think there was a candidate died late in the campaign, and the rules require them to have a rerun either this week or next. It's likely to be Tory. It's a fairly strongly Tory seat in North Yorkshire. And the first Green MP, it doesn't really show, there's a little green bit in Brighton. She got elected in Brighton, which is quite significant. And as you see, the Northern Irish Party situation is totally different. The hung parliament has only occurred once at one other election since World War II in February 1974. But in fact, minority or coalition governments prior to World War II were quite common. In fact, more common than otherwise. From about 1910 to World War II, most of those years there was either a minority government or a coalition with various combinations. Sometimes con-lib-lab, sometimes lib-lab, sometimes con-lib, sometimes con half of Labour and the Liberals. But the idea that this is an unheard of thing in British politics, it's only in the context of the post-1945 situation. Pre-45, when there was a lot of flux in the party system with sort of Labour coming through to surpass the Liberals, coalition minority governments were quite common. David Cameron's situation here, the Tories didn't get the outright majority they would have wanted, but David Cameron very much wanted to get into number 10 Downing Street. The Tories were out of power for 13 years. That concentrates the mind wonderfully. They really wanted to get back into power. Conservative Party is a party based on being in government. And so another term out of government was not acceptable to the Conservative leadership. It may have been to a few of the hardliners on the right of the party, but it certainly was not party leadership. Cameron also, I think, understood that while he could probably have formed a minority government and defied the other parties to bring him down, it would have been, that's what Harold Wilson did in February 1974. But that would be very unstable, too unstable to administer the tough economic medicine required, and too unstable really to do anything effective in terms of delivering policy. It would have been a short-term solution, and there probably would have been, as in 1974, another election in the autumn of 2010 if he had gone that route. Also for Cameron, coalition with the Liberal Democrats provided some advantages because it made him somewhat less beholden to the hardcore anti-EU conservative right wing. It mitigated their influence, and I think that influence is something that was very dangerous for him and the party and could potentially have wrecked his opportunities in government. For the Liberals, I suppose if you scratched the Liberals hard or pushed them hard, they would say they might have preferred to work with the Labour Party rather than the Conservatives. They've traditionally regarded the Conservatives as their main enemy, and in most, there are more constituencies where Liberal and Conservative face off against each other than there are Liberal and Labour. But on the other hand, this was a hard deal to turn down for Nick Clegg. I mean, here was a chance at real power with cabinet seats. I mean, no Liberal has sat in a cabinet since Churchill's wartime coalition. That's an awful long time. And Nick Clegg and most of the other senior Liberals, they're not interested in protest politics. They got into politics to govern. Liberal Party has also gotten used to being in government at the local level, often with the Conservatives. And in Scotland, they formed a coalition with Labour for 10 years after the Scottish Parliament was established. So, it was a very hard deal to turn down if they were being offered a real shot at power and a meaningful voice in the government of the country. The Labour option, which I think they had to flirt with, basically to show that they were taking it seriously to the grassroots of their party, was never really on the cards. They still wouldn't have had 326, even if you added Labour and Liberal together. It wouldn't have been a majority. They might have cobbled together something with, the support of what the snotty London papers call the Celtic fringe parties. The Northern Irish parties and the Welsh and Scottish nationalists, but that would not have been stable. And I mean, one errant MP could have just pulled the rug out from such a government on a whim, and again, the question of such a government being able to deliver tough economic policies did not seem very likely. Also, I think Clegg was very wary of the idea of a coalition of the losers, which would have been pinned on such an arrangement. Said, you know, you both lost seats, why are you in power? And also, of course, the adverse effect on the economy of a very unstable lib-lab, Nat Irish arrangement. You know, that I think the senior Liberals understood that they had to listen to what Labour had to say, but this was not really a viable option. The deal, well, it's complex as all deals are, but I kind of boiled it down. The Liberal Democrats, in essence, promised to support cuts in public expenditure of about $6 billion now. £6 billion, I think, sorry. The interesting thing about the election is that everybody knew there was this economic crisis facing the country, but it didn't really become part of the debate in the election campaign. Everybody carried on as though it wasn't there, except for the Liberal Democrats' economic spokesman, Vince Cable, who was very candid about what needed to be done. But, you know, the campaign sort of took place in a kind of blissful Neverland, and then the harsh reality, waking up with a hangover in terms of having to handle this very difficult economic situation. The Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives basically pledged that they would agree to deliver the nasty medicine. The Conservatives agreed to jettison some tax reductions that they'd planned for the very well-off, including a big raising of the threshold of inheritance taxes. There's some consensus between the parties on the need for reform in education and in the NHS, and the Conservatives had to concede some political reform to the Liberal Democrats. I mean, the Liberal Democrats couldn't have entered the coalition without something in terms of reform of the electoral system. They've had a long-standing interest in making the system more proportional so that they get the number of seats or something like it that their percentage of the popular vote would entitle them to. Both parties were in a sort of bidding war, sort of offering candy to the Liberal Democrats after the election in terms of political reform. What the Conservatives gave them was a promise of a referendum on the alternative vote system for Westminster elections. That is not a proportional system, but it's basically instant runoff. And some of you, I'm sure, have used it for elections or sort of job selection processes where you have a number of candidates, eliminate the bottom one, and then the bottom one's votes are redistributed to the others, and so on until somebody gets 50. It would keep single-member districts with alternative vote system. That would, in a sense, be a camel's nose under the tent for a more proportional system in the future, perhaps, and it would undoubtedly give the Liberal Democrats a shot at more seats, because the wasted vote argument would disappear to a large extent. It's not the optimal system that they would like, but definitely it's a start. They're getting a referendum on it, and they'll have a chance to make that argument to the British public. I don't think Cameron could have delivered anything more on proportional representation than that. House of Lords reform is promised again. It's going to, I guess, the idea of some kind of proportional election of the Lords. Fixed-term parliaments, which is a very interesting one. The idea of the Prime Minister being able to call elections at any time during the 5-year span being replaced by making it extremely hard to dissolve Parliament. And I think this is part of the coalition showing that it's serious, and also, making sure that somebody's not going to sort of pull out on the deal on a whim. They're basically suggesting that, you know, the fixed-term parliament, unless you can get a no-confidence vote and then a subsequent vote where 55% of the Commons votes out the government. It sets very formidable hurdles. There's been a lot of argument in the British press as to whether this is a fundamental violation of the Constitution. It's highly undemocratic. From the point of view of the LibCon coalition, it is, though, I think, a device to sort of try to keep them in bed together rather than being tempted to fly off on a whim. Overall, I think it's a reasonably good deal for both parties. I think maybe the Liberal Democrats could have gotten a little more. I was somewhat surprised that Nick Clegg didn't take a senior portfolio for himself in addition to being the Deputy Prime Minister. I thought the Conservatives could have given the Home Office to a Liberal Democrat, but you know, in the end it was good for Cameron that he was able to get most of his senior spokesmen in the places where he wanted them. Former party leader William Hague at the Foreign Office, the very youthful George Osborne as his Chancellor. The main question, I think, is, you know, for the coalition is, can they survive the backlash that's going to come if they actually start cutting public spending and, you know, it hits home on Britain's very large public sector. And I'll finish by sort of going over some of the implications as far as the U.S. is concerned. I'll have a swig of water now. Conservatives have traditionally been regarded as a very pro-American party. But since 1945, actually most tensions between, when British-US relations have been tense, it's usually been under Conservative prime ministers, not Labour prime ministers. Suez, of course, in the 50s, between Eden and Eisenhower. Kennedy and Macmillan really didn't get on all that well. Heath and Nixon really didn't get on well. And Major and Clinton didn't get on well. So, Labour, you know, on the whole, most Labour governments since the war had very good relations with the American administrations of the time, surprisingly so in the case of Blair and Bush. The Conservatives were equivocal at best on the Iraq war. They had the luxury of being in opposition. There was no pressure on them to support it. Many of them thought it was pure folly. The Liberal Democrats were hostile to the UK military commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And also they were opposed to the renewal of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. The Conservatives are, of the major parties, the most skeptical of the European Union and opposed to further integration. But the Liberal Democrats are almost Euro-federalists. Traditionally, they've been the most enthusiastic Europeans of all the three most important British parties. On the other hand, the new Foreign Secretary, William Hague, is a conservative Atlanticist. Note his very early visit to Washington. He had hardly sort of put his pictures on his desk in the Foreign Office before he was off to meet with Hillary Clinton. I think that was symbolically intended to send a message. So I think the foreign policy of the government is likely to be more conservative, I think, than liberal. The Liberals took some very, could be interpreted, I suppose, as anti-US stances in the campaign, but those don't seem to have been deal-breaker issues as far as the coalition was concerned. I mean, Nick Clegg has a very, I think it balances out the conservative Atlanticism, I suppose, because Nick Clegg has a very strong background in the EU. I think he worked in the EU. His wife is Spanish. I think he speaks at least one or two European languages. He's very sort of European, and I suppose it kind of balances out. But I don't see any radical change in direction of British foreign policy coming from this government. because the real radicals in either party aren't really controlling the foreign policy offices. Obviously, I think the US needs the new UK government to begin sorting out the country's economic problems. The fear of a spillover from a financial meltdown in the UK, of course, would negatively impact the US and all Western economies, and would be like Greece times 10, or maybe times 100. They want a stable UK government to support the US in Afghanistan and play that traditional bridge role to the other EU nations that British governments have played. The defeat of Labour ends the Clinton-Blair third way era for centre-left parties. There was a lot of talk, I think, in the late 90s about how Clinton and Blair had sort of redefined socialism, liberalism in American terms, in a much more centrist and pragmatic and pro-market direction. I think that exhausted itself. Much of it disappeared when Blair left number 10. Brown went some way along with it, but he was not nearly as enthusiastic as his predecessor in that regard. And I think it's somewhat exhausted itself on this side of the Atlantic as well. It's had the Obama administration doesn't look third way to me. It looks like a much more sort of traditional New Dealish type democratic administration. And I think Brown's government looked like a much more traditionally Labour government than Blair's did. The question, I think, is will Labour in opposition head in a more leftward, anti-US direction as it did in the 80s, when they almost jumped off the cliff politically and condemned themselves to, 3 election defeats? Or will they sort of regroup around a more centrist leadership and wait for, the coalition to implode? They have a they have a very interesting leadership contest coming up between 2 parties. I think Mr. Ed Ball from more the Brownite wing of the party, that, in a sense, they're going to be headless for months, which is an advantage for the coalition. Labour won't have new leadership until the autumn. It could be a very divisive contest, but it'd be interesting to see what happens with the major opposition party. If it stays roughly in the center-left, or if it veers in a leftward direction that makes it harder for them to come back into government in the short term. I think I'm going to stop there. I've said plenty. Hope I've given you a few things to think about, and I'm sure you'll have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John?
First of all, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Oh, that was fun.
I have two questions really. One is, in the interim, does Gordon Brown remain leader of the opposition until someone is chosen to take his place?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And secondly, David Cameron made a statement that he thought that British foreign policy should not be restricted to the Atlantic-Europe axis, but in fact that Britain should look beyond to countries like India, the largest democracy in the world, and begin to diversify its foreign policy. He made that statement. So it'll be interesting to see actually what does develop with British foreign policy as to whether they're going to downplay the US or not. I mean, they can't really downplay it that much, but I mean, it may be that the US will be less important in the total picture in the future if Cameron's statement has validity.
I think it's quite a prudent statement for him to make. I mean, British politics has been in that kind of, it's either Europe or the US paradigm in terms of foreign policy, and for a middling power like Britain, I think it may be prudent to actually look look a little more widely at what's happening in terms of the growing economies in the world, and growing economies to which they may have some cultural connection, like, I mean, India is an obvious case in point. The Conservatives, I think in the Thatcher era, the Conservatives kind of tossed out the old Commonwealth idea, because Mrs. Thatcher wasn't personally at all sympathetic to it, and didn't think it mattered. And it was just an excuse for a lot of former colonial heads to get together and sort of carp about how awful Britain was. But from her perspective, but I think Cameron, Cameron may have some scope there to do some different things. In terms of his team, I think Haig is one of the more able members of his leadership team. Haig became leader of the party in a hopeless situation. He was way too young. And he very sensibly left after one thrashing at the hands of Labour and sort of rehabilitated his career. I think, he's going to be one of the more serious players in the Cameron government. And, an obvious alternative leader if that became necessary. I see him very much as number 2 in the Tory ranks and sort of number 3 in the government.
No question.
It was a very interesting article in the Economist. I don't know if you read it, but it was really very, very strongly in support of very much of what you've been saying. Felt that the coalition was going to be very good for the country. It was going to be the two of them were very pragmatic, Labour and Cameron, and that they were going to be very much counterbalancing each other in their particular areas, exactly as you've described. Very interesting article indeed. I recommend it for anybody reading.
Well, I think for their own sakes, it better be good for the country. There's a lot at stake here, I think, for both their leaderships. Neither one of them can afford to have this fail.
Yeah.
It's clear that, there are many in the Conservative Party who I think, particularly on the right of the party, who blame Cameron for not winning the election, and have been totally hostile to his reforming project. If you want to get a flavor of their thinking, just look at the Daily Telegraph on a daily basis, where they regularly take swipes at him. And for Clegg, it's very important to demonstrate, I think, that the Liberal Party can govern, can be part of government. And his leadership's on the line too. If this doesn't work, there's no shortage of other young, Liberal MPs who wouldn't fancy a chance to be the party leader. So I think they are very much tied together. And they will try very hard to make this work. And I think it could be much more stable, especially if this fixed term parliament idea is implemented than people think. I think if I was a Labour supporter, I wouldn't delude myself into thinking that this is all going to break up and there'll be another election before Christmas and they'll come romping back under David Miliband. I don't think so. I think it's going to last. I would bet that it's going to last a year or two, and maybe the full whack, maybe the full term, because the leaders have a lot invested in it.
It was interesting that the article also stressed the fact that this coalition helps to neutralize the extremes of both parties, and it's helping them to overcome the extreme right and the extreme left. Very interesting, helping the leaders in that respect.
Mm-hmm. It certainly does.
Can I ask, what is it about the UK which makes minority government almost a very unstable outcome when there are other nations, Canada, New Zealand, where minority governments are very successful?
Yeah, I know less about New Zealand. I know that Canada has been able to make it work for fairly longer periods of time. I can only say I can only say in the Canadian case, I think you have a party system that's even more regionally skewed than the UK's. And the huge factor of Quebec in the middle. And so that a minority government can hobble along in Canada quite effectively, because uniting the opposition there is even harder than it is in a UK context. I mean, Quebec is sort of the great 800-pound gorilla with its huge block of, you know, Quebec First. I mean, they various party names, even Quebec Liberals. I mean, so and the Canadians, I think, have gotten quite adept at it. And also remember, Canada's a federal system. So a party that's not in power in Ottawa may, you know, be in power in many of the largest provinces like Ontario or Quebec or Alberta. So they're not, and you know, I mean, the Canadian provinces have really strong powers. It's a very strong federal system. So, I mean, there are other areas for the parties to govern if they're not in power nationally. Whereas the UK is a kind of quasi-federal, you know, with the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish parliaments, but there's 45 million English who just have one parliament in Westminster. So I think the centralized nature of the British system kind of makes it more likely that the opposition parties are going to gang up on a minority government. I think the other problem for a Cameron minority government was, you know, getting the votes to deliver tough medicines and sort of keeping the markets happy. I mean, the markets want to see stability. The coalition provides more stability than a Cameron minority would have. I mean, if he'd had a minority, again, you know, he would have had his 306 and tried to get to 326 by cutting deals with here and there with, you know, nationalists, Ulster Unionists, the Green MP, but it would have been a scraping together to get to that majority, maybe Liberals abstaining here and there, but I don't, you know, I think there are concerns about stability. I mean, Wilson was able to hobble on for 6 months in '74. I don't think it was a very happy experience. I seem to remember the economy getting in terrible shape during that year. He basically hung on long enough till he could call a second election, which he thought he could win, which he did by the skin of his teeth. And I mean, that government lasted for 5 years, but again, it was never all that stable because it relied, the majority disappeared in by-elections, and they relied on various arrangements with various opposition parties. I mean, I remember there was one MP who was flown in from Northern Ireland who never usually showed up to the House of Commons. I think his name was Frank Maguire, and he ran a bar somewhere in a small town.
That's how he got his votes.
And, you know, Labour would wheel him in. I mean, if he appeared, you knew that it was likely to be a close vote because, you know, they'd get him in to prop up the government. But I mean, that's not the situation that Cameron wanted to be in.
You know, sorry. No, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday trying to analyze why Cameron had not attracted more voters, really, because he's young, compassionate, you know, dashing, etc. And it was saying that Maggie Thatcher attracted more of the middle class voters than Cameron did, and that maybe part of the image of Cameron that he tried to portray is not what the younger, in other words, there's a bit of a class structure, as we know in England still. And it's a feeling like here we are, the old school, and also not many women in the government, as we've seen, only 3 women, I think, in the cabinet. So it's, I think Cameron, you know, it's interesting, although he's young, dashing, etc., he doesn't seem to have attracted the votes that we've seen, and so maybe the Liberal Democrats somehow picked up more of those votes this time on paper, but I just wonder if you have an observation on that.
Well, she was more of an instinctive populist than Cameron is. I think, I mean, Cameron's background is, you know, Thatcher was the middle-class girl made good. And I think she spoke much more powerfully to particularly the English middle class than someone like Cameron can do. And also, I mean, Thatcher was not, you know, she wasn't afraid to take populist positions. And, you know, on Europe, remember, she would go to Europe and say, I want my money back. And of course, that played tremendously well in the British tabloid press. You know, they called it Maggie's Millions. You know, she was sort of trying to get money back from the EU budget and said, give me my money. I mean, that's not Cameron's style. I think he shies away from sort of right-wing populism because he's scared of it. Maybe he's not such an effective deliverer over it as she was. Because coming from his background, it's hard to, you know, it's kind of hard to be a right-wing populist. I mean, he didn't make, you know, there are many right-wing conservatives wanted to see him make more of Europe or anti-Europe, and they wanted to see him make more of immigration and issues of that kind. But I don't think it's in his DNA to do that. He's not by nature a populist. I think he's a consensualist. He's kind of a reformer. I mean, he can't neglect the sort of populist right element in the party too much. They have to be thrown a bone, but I don't think he wants to be governed by them. I mean, the populist right-wingers would say, you know, yes, he should have gone out, you know, and tried, you know, to get more middle and working class voters for the Tories by emphasizing, you know, an anti-Brussels foreign policy and sort of anti-immigration type issues. But, I mean, those are explosive issues. Moreover, you know, there are fringe parties that exist on those issues. I didn't sort of break it out on my chart, but there's the UK Independence Party, which exists only to campaign against the European Union. And, you know, there's the British National Party, which, you know, is sort of the anti-immigrant right. And if you add those two together and had all their voters voted Tory, then Cameron might have got to his majority. But on the other hand, if you play around with those, sort of appealing to those elements, you lose votes in the center. So it's a very delicate balance for him.
How do you see Nick Gregg's function as Deputy Prime Minister without portfolio? There's never been a Deputy Prime Minister without portfolio. And it puts him in a very either strong or weak position. Where do you see him fitting in? What would his role be in the government?
Yeah, I was kind of interested by that too. I mean, I thought he would take a portfolio. I thought he would take the Home Office, which is the one that, you know, seemed the most logical one to give him. I imagine there was some degree of personal choice there. I imagine that if he'd really wanted a portfolio, he could have got one. So it seems to me that he was personally happier with being a deputy prime minister with that portfolio, maybe because it allows him to, he doesn't get distracted by having to deal with departmental matters. I mean, he can be a true deputy prime minister in the sense of, you know, looking at the broad picture. It leaves him in a way short of business on a day-to-day basis, sort of short of routine business, but I think it allows him to sort of be a wide-ranging, in a sense, a true deputy. Like the Prime Minister, he's, you know, overseeing the whole.
But in his role as a Deputy Prime Minister, would he have access to the same feedbacks that the Prime Minister has?
I can't say for sure. But I think he would try very hard to have that access in terms of security materials and security briefings and so forth. Now, you know, in Britain they're traditionally rather secretive about these things, so I don't know how much we would ever know of what arrangements were made between the two of them on those matters. But arrangements will probably have been made. And as a strong deputy PM, he would be striving to get as much access as he possibly could.
Would it not be comparable to the role of a Vice President of the United States, where the stronger ones have a role to play, the weaker ones attend the funerals?
I think he's going to be in a stronger position than that because he leads a party that the coalition relies on for its majority. I mean, certainly he would be comparable to the stronger ones, like the Gores or the Cheneys. But even in a way, he's in an even stronger position than they were, simply because he controls a block of votes that this coalition depends on for a majority. So I mean, it is an interesting kind of redefinition of that deputy prime ministerial role, and a little constitutional innovation there that I think is it's going to be very interesting to watch.
I wonder,
question.
in the British elections, or the UK elections, if there was a role for social media and what role it might have played, and is it a phenomenon like it is in the United States? And are there some interesting anecdotal evidence that it helped certain people get elected? I suppose raising money is not an issue, but or is it? I don't know.
Well,
What role did it play?
I mean, with the money first, the Conservatives. You know, in Britain, money doesn't get you too far because it's much more restricted. You can't buy TV time with money. You can buy newspaper ads, which may not be that effective. And you can pump money into campaigns. I mean, the Conservatives had a big initiative to push money into the marginal districts through millionaire Lord Ashcroft. Then he became controversial because he wasn't paying UK taxes and so forth. But the Ashcroft money probably did help them win, you know, a good chunk of those 90 odd gains that they made during the election. On the social media, I'm not really qualified to say. I haven't read that much about the impact of things like Facebook and Twitter and so forth. I know that everybody, you know, so the British chattering classes have become the Twittering classes because they're all Twittering like mad all the time about everything. At the elite level, at the mass level, I'd be interested. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you've seen something on this. I haven't. You know, it's possible that an incumbent MP might be able to use those quite effectively, seeing as they are so cheap in terms of mobilizing younger voters and so forth. But I haven't really read anything about the impact of social media. I mean, it got tremendous attention here with the Obama campaign in 2008. But I haven't read too much about how it was used in 2010. But I'm sure it was.
The Lib Dems used it quite a bit.
Pardon?
The Lib Dems
Yeah.
used it quite a bit, were quite successful with the younger voter.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also interesting in the number I mentioned earlier on, the number of turnout. I mean, near 70%, which again tends to be the younger voter that they're getting, both in the US and the UK in the last two elections, is interesting.
Yeah, it had been going down, and it did jump up in this election. I think that's, you know, it was a more interesting election. I think you had new alternatives on show, which mobilized voters more. Although they did get into embarrassment on election night. You know, they didn't have enough polling stations in some places. And I remember how much they laughed at the U.S. over Florida in 2000. It was kind of little irony there, I suppose.
Exactly. David, you have one last question?
Yeah, it was just an observation. I support your view of, I think William Hague's matured well, I think, in the Foreign Secretary. He was keen to reinforce that UK-US relationship. What's the view from the US about the outcome of the election and the Parliament?
As far as I can gauge, they're happy to have a stable government, I think. I mean, it's often somewhat odd that you know, I mentioned before that conservative administrations have sometimes not gotten along that well with Washington. Labor administrations sometimes haven't gotten on that well with Democratic administrations in Washington. I don't think there was certainly the Brown-Obama relationship was somewhat tense. It seemed that the Obama administration did not, you know, there appeared to be slighting him. I don't know if it was intentional or what, but there was certainly an impression in the British media that the Obama administration didn't take him quite seriously, didn't pay him the homage that they think a British Prime Minister should be paid. On the other hand, Obama was the first on the phone to congratulate Cameron. There's more of a generational compatibility between them. So, you know, I think the tone of the relationship may get better. There are many conservatives who rather like Obama. I mean, you know, sometimes people like Boris Johnson are always raving about how great Obama is. So, I mean, they want a stable, the U.S. wants a stable government who's not, you know, who's going to support him in Afghanistan, who's going to support him in NATO and the G20, and that's, you know, going to shore up its economy. And if the coalition delivers those things, I think the U.S. would be happy. I don't see obvious points of tension in this relationship.
Well, thank you very much indeed,
Thank you,
Nicole.
Greg.
Thank you.